Hello everyone, thank you for taking an interest in my presentation. I'm Poppy, I'm an MA student at Lancaster University and I'll be starting my linguistics PhD at Lancaster later this year. This is going to be the topic of my presentation and it's provisionally titled Mad Linguistics, a corpus-based and service user informed critical discourse analysis of OCD forums. This basically means that I'll be researching the language used by individuals with OCD on online forums using computer-assisted linguistic techniques and involving people with lived experience of OCD in my research. I'm also an OCD sufferer. I was diagnosed in 2013 and my experiences with OCD become relevant when talking about my PhD because I'll be approaching my analysis as someone who identifies as mad. And I'm really keen to foreground my own lived experience and the experiences of other service users in my research. And this is something that I think we can do more and make more prominent in applied linguistics more generally. So in this presentation, I'll be structuring it around 4 key questions I think really help to summarise the rationale of my project. These are: why study language use by people with OCD/OCD sufferers? What is corpus-based critical discourse analysis? How will service users inform my research? And what might I/we expect to find? And before I continue, I want to make clear that I'm also very conscious of the language I'm using in this presentation. Some terms might be a bit more contentious, so whether we call individuals with OCD people with OCD or OCD sufferers, whether we call people with that lived experience service users, survivors, and whether kind of the I and we distinction is about the extent to which my research can be considered truly participatory as a PhD project. So I want to stress that these terms are very fluid for me at the moment, and if anyone has any thoughts about the most appropriate to use or if anyone has any preferences, I'd love to have a chat and talk more. So first off, my first question: why study language use by OCD sufferers? So in applied linguistics more generally, there's an increasing body of research that takes linguistic approaches to mental illness or mental distress. A lot of this research considers first-person accounts of mental illness or distress and look at those experiences from a variety of different genres as well. So there's been research around clinical and non-clinical experiences of voice hearing, which looked at interview data, metaphors of depression, which looked at blog data or kind of the online blogs that people write about their experiences, and also men's suicide notes. So kind of more personal, I suppose more sensitive area of data as well. So there's a lot of scope for linguistic research to mental illness. And regarding OCD specifically, I think that the growing body of research around language and OCD shows that we have a lot to learn about OCD from what sufferers have to say. So Olivia Knapton, who's also presenting at this conference, has researched a lot around the heterogeneity of OCD and OCD episode, which is a new framework of considering different subtypes of OCD based on the language that they use to describe their experiences. Knapton and Rundblad have also looked at personification of OCD, the mind, obsessions and emotions. So personification also can include metaphor, so how we frame our experiences of OCD and what the metaphors that we use might say about our experiences. Coimbra-Gomes, one of the conference organisers, and Moschenbacher have also looked more specifically at sexual orientation themed OCD and what that specific subtype can tell us about language, gender and normativity more generally. And I'm hoping to add to this research looking at online OCD forums following the framework that Hunt and Brookes propose in their book Corpus, Discourse and Mental Health. So that's why I think we should study language use by OCD sufferers from a linguistic point of view, but from a participatory point of view and from someone who also has OCD. I really like this quote by Peter Beresford, who says that we need to interrogate the dominant languages that we are subjected to. And I've underlined the pronoun we there because I think that really makes clear that in research more generally, people with lived experience need to have kind of more of a say, more of involvement in the research that we're producing around OCD. And that's something that I also want to incorporate in my PhD. So secondly then, what is corpus-based critical discourse analysis? So I've split this into two parts. So I'll first look at critical discourse analysis and then look at how it's corpus-based. So critical discourse studies sees discourse, so language use in speech and writing, as a form of social practice. In other words, we do things with language, in terms of everyday interactions, building relationships with people, conveying information. That is how we're viewing language here. Fairclough and Vodak argue that discourse is socially constitutive as well as socially conditioned. So the language that we use in these discourses shape our societies and our views around them, as well as being shaped by society and kind of our linguistic practices. It's a very dual concept. They argue that discourse is socially consequential. It gives rise to important issues of power. And that's really where I think the link between critical discourse studies and participatory ideology comes to the forefront, because they are both to do with kind of who has the power in terms of language and deciding what knowledge can be spread, and what can be said, about our research. And finally, discursive practices. So the language used, kind of how the discourse is kind of literally used, the language that we're using, may have major ideological effects. That is, they can help produce and reproduce unequal power relations between social groups. And this argument around unequal power relations, so in my case, it might be the way that people with OCD use language to describe their interactions with doctors or GPs, medical practices, how people interact with kind of OCD in their everyday lives. And those unequal power relations are something that could be traced through these discursive practices, so through language. Now, critical discourse studies, like any area of research, has received some criticisms, and these are outlined by Vodak and Mayer. They say that people who do critical discourse analysis are often accused of cherry picking, so just picking out the data that supports their own arguments, and fulfilling researcher bias, and that people approach critical discourse analysis with some preconceptions, with some ideas they want to prove, and only pick the data that supports that idea. Now, whilst I think that obviously we do need to get a balance in terms of the research that we produce and it being reliable and it being kind of sufficiently detailed and comprehensive, Peter Beresford, who, when talking about participatory ideology, he makes this quote, which I think is fantastic, of the greater the distance between direct experience and its interpretation, then the more likely resulting knowledge is to be inaccurate, unreliable, and distorted. So here, Beresford is advocating for us to have kind of a more kind of direct, kind of closer involvement with, service users, with people with lived experience, in order to produce this knowledge. Because, if you have lived experience, you have you can draw on your own knowledge of kind of what it's like to have OCD or whatever you might be researching. Now, that's kind of critical discourse analysis. So corpus-based critical discourse analysis has been suggested as a way of reducing researcher bias and reducing cherry picking by using computer-based techniques. So a corpus is a large sample of electronic texts that represents a predetermined language variety, mode of communication, genre or topic. So for example, we might get a corpus of spoken British English, which have been compiled. We might get a corpus of newspapers, and they can be really specific. So my corpus will be a corpus of OCD forums. Corpus linguistic tools enable us to use more quantitative techniques. So that's things like looking at keywords, collocates and engrams, which I won't go into too much detail about now, but basically they help to portray kind of the statistical relevance of certain words that are worthy of analysis, that stand out in the data. And Baker specifically argues that triangulating critical discourse analysis with corpus tools may decrease the likelihood of cherry picking, because the researcher is going to be more inclined to search the words or phrases that come up as significant using those tools. Now, you'll notice I've got scare quotes around quantitative in the second bullet point and a little question mark around cherry picking. That's because and Baker himself has questioned the extent to which corpus approaches to critical discourse analysis can reduce cherry picking. because, you can do all of the kind of statistical measures in the world that you want to do, all the computer-aided techniques, but in the end, there are still a lot of decisions that researchers have to make and qualitative analysis to do with that data. And I'll just show you actually a small illustrative example of what that could look like. So this is a data from a corpus of news reports that mention the word OCD in their reports. It'll give you a very kind of tiny insight into what I'm looking at the moment for my MA dissertation. And here are the 30 collocates of OCD. So there is a very famous quotation in Corpus Linguistics that states that you know a word by the company it keeps. And this idea is that collocates are when you take a word like OCD and it brings up the words that are statistically likely to co-occur with that word in the surrounding context to help create its meaning. So when you do these statistical measures, so I looked for any corpus linguistics, corpus linguists watching, I looked at OCD from a span of 5 to the left and the right with a statistical measure of mutual information cubed. And this gave kind of this table of this kind of results. These are the 30 top collocates of OCD. Now, this isn't the end of the research. The analyst will then have to look into what sort of thing we could say about these research, or what else we could do with this data. So we could look at OCD and, because we've got the connective and anxiety and depression. There might be a discourse of kind of OCD alongside other illnesses in this metaphor data, in this newspaper data. We could look at if there are any first person accounts or personal relevance, because we can see that we get the first person pronouns I and my. We might also look at how people with OCD are constructed, because we have the collocates people and sufferers. So there might be a bit of people versus sufferers kind of challenge going on. Or we can see, I'm sure everyone's favourite bits, adjective bits, which could imply the use of the colloquial uses of OCD, like I'm a bit OCD, and see how they're present in the data as well. So the point is, there's, even just from these top 30 collocates, there's lots of entry points to the data and what we could research further. And that relies on a kind of the researcher making the decision of what would be more interesting to look at, what would be kind of new findings, and it's not just describing exactly what you'd expect. But I'd argue as well that when we're thinking about what should we research from this illustrative example of collocates, and I think let's ask people with lived experience. So what people with OCD would find interesting, would find important to know about, to help make these decisions in the analysis. Which leads me nicely to my third question: how will service users inform the research? And I am planning on having focus groups, maybe 3 to 4 throughout the PhD, of people with OCD, with lived experience, and getting them involved in the analytical process as I'm looking at kind of all of these discourses and all these kind of statistical measures. So, and by doing that, I aim to be kind of openly transparent about my research. So informing them about my research questions, some initial findings, what it is that I'm hoping to achieve with my PhD, and then also present data that I found, and crucially, let service users work with the data, have a go at analysing what is interesting for them, what is significant for them to know about, so that my findings can be arguably kind of important for stakeholders, people that this research is intended to benefit. So whilst doing that with my kind of with focus groups, I'm going to be following as much as possible the 4PI national involvement standards that were created by the National Survivor User Network. And these are basically a set of principles about when we're involving service users or people with lived experience, what sort of thing should we be considering? And this tracks the research process right from kind of all the points that they can be involved. So the principles, so what it is I'm going to be studying, so like the OCD forums using critical discourse analysis and corpus linguistics, the purpose, why am I involving service users, and that's hopefully to make my findings more relevant to stakeholders. We have a presence, so who is involved and why are people getting involved. The process being open in that they are doing some of the data analysis and helping decide what is going to be important for me to look at in my final thesis. And the impact, so what difference does involvement make, and how can we tell that we've made a difference? And that is one that I'm thinking a little bit harder about, how I can measure the impact of having service users, but that might be something that comes out of the focus groups, considering I've not actually started yet. And although payment isn't mentioned in any of these kind of 4 principles, it is mentioned by the National Survivor User Network, and I'm very fortunate to be funded by the ESRC, which gives me access to funding that allow me to pay participants, which I think is very important, because I'm asking people to give up their time, analyse data and talk about their own experiences as well. So a little caveat at the bottom. So I'm following these involvement standards as much as is possible in a PhD. Because as much as I would love to do fully fledged participatory research, a PhD is limited by being an independent research project. So I'm recognising that by calling in the title of my thesis, calling it service user informed, not service use research. But I'm going to try follow these participatory principles as much as I can. And if anyone in the conference has any insights about doing participatory research, I'd love to chat more about that. So then the final question, what might I/we expect to find? Very kind of hesitant questions here, because of course, what I'm going to be researching is to some extent going to be guided by people with lived experience with my focus groups. So this could completely change by the time I actually go about to do the research. But some tentative questions. So how are OCD subtypes used in online forums? Are they encouraged or discouraged? Are they accepted or rejected? Some people might have encountered kind of when people talk about having harm OCD, paternal OCD, and sexual orientation OCD, of kind of categorizing their experiences by the content of their intrusive thoughts. But some people think that actually that's not very useful. So I'd be interested to see kind of how they're used in online forums and what that says about kind of online discourses of OCD. The second bullet point, what metaphors do people with OCD use and how might that help to frame their experiences? What can we learn about that? Is OCD a monster, a battle or a journey? There has been some research on OCD metaphors previously, but I'd like to expand on that by looking specifically at the genre of online forums and how those metaphors are used. I've also put a note about C. Semino et al. On cancer metaphors. There's some great research looking at how we can help use metaphors around cancer to kind of help people to shape and frame their experiences, which I'd love to build on. And then finally, how do people talk about their experiences with psychiatric services, diagnosis, doctors and medication? That's something I've not seen a lot of in terms of language use around OCD, and I'd love to kind of look a little bit more in depth around the discourses around kind of medical experiences of OCD and how they're framed on OCD forums. And that can be partly based on work by Baker, Brookes and Evans, who looked at the language of NHS patient feedback, and they looked a lot at how doctors and kind of medical discourses were represented in that data. So a couple of concluding points then, or in terms of the future of critical OCD studies, what am I going to be contributing? So hopefully more research on language and OCD. I'm going to be advocating for participatory research in applied linguistics and especially corpus approaches to critical discourse studies. And I argue that there should be a greater emphasis on the researcher's position in terms of kind of stating where I'm coming from as an OCD sufferer and how that has informed the research. And all things that I'm hoping to incorporate in my PhD. So thank you very much for listening. I'll be speaking at the first panel on the conference. So if you have any questions, you can ask me there, or you can get in contact with me via email or on Twitter, which will run the first slides. And I have my references here in case you want to have a look at any of them further. Thank you very much.